some rate. So there's a rate of a secret key and there's a rate of communication. So like how much communication is needed to generate a secret key of a certain rate within this model. That's going to be the general flavor of this talk. So I could say that like this is joint work, ongoing work with started out with my student Manoj, and then like we started collaborating with the group in Hong Kong with Cheng Chan and his student Zhao Zhao Zhao. And Cheng at the time was at Chinese University of Hong Kong. I think he may have moved to the City University. Some people may know this. People here, like, is that true? Yes, City University. Yeah, he has moved to the City University of Hong Kong. So quickly, like to give you the preliminaries here. So we have. So I'll give the overview of the multi-terminal source model, and then jump right into the notion of communication complexity. And the main part of this talk is really going to be on this last segment here, lower bound. So we'll try to get to that. That's the most interesting part, and we'll try to get to that as soon as possible. So the basic setup is that we have m. It's a purely information theoretic setup. We have m terminals who wish to generate a common secret key among themselves. There's a source with m components, which has some joint distribution, and the terminals observe n i.i.d. realization of the source. So each terminal observes a realization of its own component, like n real i.i.d. realizations of its own component, and the joint distribution of the source is known to everybody. And from this, they're allowed to communicate over a public noiseless channel, and finitely many rounds of interactive communication is allowed. And interactive means that the communication from a terminal F at a certain time depends on whatever the terminal has seen up to that point of time, including all the public communication that has taken place up to that point of time. So we'll use this boldface F to denote the entire communication center of the public channel. We'll see that we'll assume that it takes values in some finite set F, and the rate of this communication will be defined in this following fashion. So 1 over n, the log of the cardinality of this set F, within which the communication takes its values. So n, remember, n is the number of observations, or like the number of realizations of the i.i.d. source, of the multi-terminal source. And after all the communication has taken place, what the goal is that the terminals should compute a common function which we will call a secret key if it satisfies these properties. So it should be computable in a distributed fashion. That is, each terminal should be able to compute the key at its own end based upon the information that it has. Okay, so it in particular will have its own observations of the source and all the public communication, and so based on that, it should be able to compute some function gi, we call that gi, and that so all of the terminals make their computations, and all the computations must agree with high probability. That's the, as n goes to infinity, as the number of realizations of the source goes to infinity. And then, okay, that makes it a common randomness that is computable at all the terminals. So then we want to make it a key, we need a notion of secrecy. That is, the key should be kept secure from the public communication. So that if you think of an eavesdropper that is there sitting on the channel, or sitting on the public noiseless channel and observing all the communication, the key should be kept more or less independent of all the communication that is taken place. Independence is measured in an asymptotic sense. That is, this is what is called the so-called strong secrecy notion. That is, the key is asymptotically independent in the sense that the mutual information goes to 0 as n goes to infinity, n being again the number of i.i.d. realizations. And we also impose this condition of uniformity. It's not particularly important, but like we do, because it's kind of for free, we can get this. It's just we have to say that the key is almost uniformly distributed, again in an asymptotic sense. Okay, almost uniformly distributed over key output. So if these three conditions are satisfied, we say that like this sequence of as n goes to infinity, with the sequence of functions kn will form a sort of a secret key sequence. And we will say that like the rate that the sequence of secret keys achieves, that is in an asymptotic sense again, the rate 1 over n h of the entropy of the key sequence, essentially if that entropy converges to some eta, that eta is called the secret key rate. Okay? So this is going to be called an achievable secret key rate, and as in the usual sense, the achievable secret key capacity is defined as the supremum of all such achievable secret key rates. Yeah, so I should say that this model originated in the work of, I guess, like in the early 90s, and the work started in the two-terminal case, and we had only two terminals, the work of Maurer, and almost simultaneously also in Csiszár. And thereafter, like in 2004, was it? That was the thing when when this model was extended to multiple terminals by Prakash Narayan and Csiszár and Csiszár. So this is now what we call the multi-terminal source model. So this is the basic setup. So the secret key capacity is well understood. Okay, within this model, the maximum executable secret key rate is a well understood notion. So here, the main theorem of in this context is that of Csiszár and Narayan in 2004. That is, the secret key capacity of the multi-terminal source model is given by this expression. It is sort of the total entropy in the source, entropy in of the source distribution, and then from that you subtract out what is called the minimum rate of communication for omniscience. That is, so this RCO is basically the total sum rate of all the communication required, or the minimum sum rate of communication required. The communication from all, we are accounting for the communication from all the terminals within this model, all the M terminals. The total communication required to ensure that each terminal is able to recover the entire observations of all the terminals. Okay, omniscience. Each terminal becomes omniscient. And it's kind of not too surprising if anybody knows source coding that like you will have this rate region, that is the kind of rates that will get you communication for omniscience, that will allow every terminal to become omniscience, are governed by these kind of Lyapunov constraints or these Kutzet bounds, where the rates that the communication rates from a set of terminals in a set P has to exceed the entropy of the set. Entropy of the observations of that set B conditioned upon what the other party, because there's a set of terminals in B complement already know. Okay. So the only difference is that here we don't account for the set B should be a strict subset of the set of all terminals, because one terminal already has its own information. It's not like in the Lyapunov case there will be some M terminals have to convey their information to a third, like a final decoder, which is different from all of them. So we will have the final constraint where the rate of communication, some rate of communication from all the terminals should also exceed the total entropy in the system. That here, we don't have that constraint here simply because this is a distributed problem. I mean, this is a problem in which there is no third party decoder. So I will comment about this in a bit more. Okay, maybe I will say one thing here, that the way that this theorem is proved, the achievability here is done in the following fashion, that you allow all the terminals to communicate at this minimum rate of communication for omniscience in such a way that all the terminals do get omniscient, and from then you apply a common hash function so every terminal now has and the entire observations, x1n, x2n, etc. up to x sub mn, all the observations are now available with high probability at every terminal, and you apply a common function to all of them, and like if you choose, sort of there is something called the leftover hash lemma or the balance coloring lemma that says that like if you sort of choose a random function with high probability, it will have the property that it will have the output of that function is going to be almost independent of all the communication that had to take place in order to get to omniscience. And at the same time, the output of all of these functions, and the total, the rate, that is the number of bits or the amount of information that is in this output is basically what is left over. That is, the total information in the system consisting of the entropy of the system, of the source, minus whatever the rate that you had to communicate at. Whatever is left over is what you can extract as a key using this balance coloring or leftover hash. We will also allow private randomness. That is, the other thing is that here up to now I've only said that the communication from a terminal depends on the observations of that terminal as well as all the prior communication that has taken place. But you can also allow sort of coin flips, sort of private coin flips or private randomness at each of the terminals. So that is like each terminal also observes some sort of independent random variables UIs. The terminal I will observe a random variable UI. The UIs are all mutually independent and also independent of the source itself. Okay. So this is sort of independent coin flips, that is randomness that is available at individual terminals. So you can in fact So these, this UI can also be utilized by these terminals to generate their communication as well as the secret key function that they finally use for the output. But it was proved in their paper that in the Csiszár and Narayan paper that the use of private randomness does not increase the secret key capacity in this model. All right. So this is all the classical. Well, okay, this is. I should say that I'll make a brief comment about sort of what I'm not going to cover in this talk. So there's related problem setups where you may have a set of. Not all the terminals may be required to generate the key. Only some subset of the terminals may be required to generate the key. The other terminals may still communicate in order to help this subset of terminals generate the key. So these will be called the terminals that don't have to generate the key, but are still allowed to help the other terminals are called helpers. And you may also have additional requirement that the key has to be kept secure from some other subset of the terminals. That is, some subset of the terminals must generate the key, but that key also must be kept secure from some other subset that is not in the original set that is generating the key. So these are called private keys. I'm not going to talk about any of these things here. I mean, some of these results will extend, but like it just becomes too complicated if you try them in the model right at the get-go. So this is sort of an important slide. That like so I've given you one characterization of the secret key capacity. There's an alternative characterization of the secret key capacity, which is much more, shall I say, which is a measure of information, which is a very interesting measure of information called multivariate mutual information. So to define this alternative characterization, we define this notion of. So we take a partition of the set of all terminals. We have m terminals, and we take a partition of that set of terminals into at least two parts. You define the mutual, or sort of what we will call the partition information. That is information with respect, mutual information with respect to this partition, in this fashion. That is, this partition consists of L components, L parts or L cells, L blocks. You look at the entropy of the observations of the terminals that you sum up all the entropies of the observations made by the terminals in each block. That is within a block, within A1, the terminals observe XA1. That's the source being observed by the terminals in A1. So you look at the entropy of that and then add that up over all the blocks, and then subtract out the total entropy of the entire source, normalized by L minus 1. And precisely this is why you require that you have at least two parts in this partition. So you normalize by L minus 1, you don't get a zero. You don't get a divide by zero problem. But I mean, that's sort of not why we do this, but I guess that allows us to make this definition of dividing by L minus 1. And then this notion, and then we define this notion of a multivariate mutual information between these m terminals. It is defined as the minimum over all the possible partitions of at least consisting of at least two parts of the mutual information with respect to that partition. Okay. So this is a theorem that so it was already known in the work of Csiszár and Narayan that the secret key capacity is upper bounded by this multivariate mutual information. This was actually shown to be an equality in this work of Cheng Chan and Li Zhongzheng in Cheng Chan's thesis from MIT. That like this is actually an equality. That is, so this gives us an alternative characterization of the secret key capacity in the multi-terminal source. Very briefly, I mean, you can spend a lot of time just studying this multivariate mutual information quantity. It's a very interesting quantity. So, for example, it is truly a generalization of mutual information. When you have two terminals, there's only one way of partitioning the two terminals into two parts. So if you just work it, then that just becomes h of x1 plus h of x2 minus h of x1 x2, which is precisely the standard mutual information between two parties. The minimizing partition also need not be unique. We'll see an example. However, there is a unique finest partition that actually achieves this minimum. And that unique finest partition is called the fundamental partition. We call it the fundamental partition, but someone calls it the fundamental partition. Sorry. And we will denote that by P star. So in other words, the multivariate mutual information is precisely the partition-wise mutual information evaluated with respect to the fundamental partition P star. So there is a partition that achieves this inequality. And this partition is unique in the sense that that is the finest such partition. Okay, so this, and also, I guess, okay, this is also useful to know that the fundamental partition P star as well as the multivariate mutual information can actually be computed in strongly polynomial time. If you try to do it in a naive fashion, like try to compute it partition by partition and minimize over all the partitions, it's not going to lead you anywhere. The number of partitions of an M set is a very large number of the order of M to the M. It's a Bell number, so it's not going to get you anywhere. But like this can actually be done in polynomial time using the submodularity properties of this function, of the entropy function. Any questions so far?
In light of the equality, is there an interpretation for the partition?
No. Yeah, yes, there is. It's too complicated to get into. Let's take that. There are interpretations. I don't want to get into that for right now. I mean, it's for example, you can also see this in the work of Himanshu. Himanshu also has some. Himanshu and Shun have some way of interpreting this. There's Chung Chang has another way of interpreting this. It's something to do with the fact that like each of the cells in the fundamental partition, in some sense, are all within themselves are highly informative within themselves. Yeah, I'm not going to, so there's a very natural clustering algorithm that leads to the fundamental partition.
May I add one point?
Yeah.
So it is true that if you, instead of having m random variables, if you took this final partition and clubbed all the members in each atom of the partition together, and they were to act in collusion, but then not cooperating across the various teams, well, you would expect the key capacity to be larger because you consolidated things, and this shows that you can't do any better than the other. It won't make a difference. So somehow they are naturally correlated in this context.
There is a natural clustering algorithm, natural or not, I can't say, but there is a nice clustering algorithm that will give you this fundamental partition. But that is not, you can also do this through like sort of submodular function optimization, getting some techniques. Fujishige's type of techniques will allow you to get to the fundamental partition. Professor Narayan may have something more to say about it.
Principal lattice of partition.
Okay. So one other definition that I will require is that as sort of a special case of the multi-terminal source model, that again a very natural definition of what we will call a hypergraphical source model, which is defined in terms of a hypergraph and a weight function. So we have a hypergraph consisting of a bunch of terminals, a bunch of vertices, which for us are our terminals. We should think of the edges of the hypergraph being basically just subsets of these vertices, as being groups of terminals, which initially have a group key among themselves. Okay? So each of these edges has a random variable sitting on it, and that random variable you should think of that as being a group secret, a secret that all the group members within that group share. So now, a particular terminal could sit in a bunch of groups. So the observations of that terminal will consist of its observations of the source. The random variable seen by that terminal, it consists of the observations of that terminal, or comprises the observations of that terminal. And then, so the idea now is that like all of these terminals must now communicate in order to generate a key that is shared by everybody, not just group wise sharing, but like there are individual groups of keys. I mean, individual groups that share a key among themselves. All of them must now communicate in order to share a common key, common to everybody. Okay. So this is what is called the hypergraphical source model. Is there a confusion? Yeah, there are hyperedges. Yeah, hypergraphical, therefore hyperedges. Special case of this, if you just look at graphs, this is the so-called pairwise independent network model. Here it's only that every pair of parties, or not every pair of parties, there are pairwise shared keys. That is like pairs of parties may share a key initially, and then finally consolidate or like communicate between all the parties must communicate publicly in order to generate a key common to everybody. So here's an example of the pin model. That is like, so here I've depicted 4 parties. Each edge denotes a pairwise key in common between them. Well, the weight of that edge denotes sort of how many bits of pairwise key there is common between those 2 terminals. If you carry out the computations, it turns out that the partition information is minimized by these 4 partitions of these terminals. There are 4 different partitions that minimize the partition information, but only one of them is the finest. In this case, it is a partition into singletons. Okay, and so that is indeed, it turns out that the secret key capacity here is. Okay, so now I'm in a position to formulate the problem. So the question that we're addressing is, what is the minimum rate of communication that we need to generate a maximum rate secret key? Okay, we know how to generate a maximum rate secret key. There is a protocol. We go through omniscience and then apply a hash function. So the minimum rate of communication for omniscience is always going to be an upper bound on the minimum rate of communication required to generate a secret key, a maximum rate secret key, to achieve a secret key capacity. But we want to know whether you can improve upon that in general, or when can you not improve upon that, and so on. And more generally, if I want to achieve a key of a certain rate eta, how much communication, what is the minimum rate of communication I need to get to that key? I don't want a maximal rate secret key. I just want some amount of secret key. How much communication do I need to get there? And of course, you can ask for the converse problem that if I'm rate limited in my communication, not converse, but like sort of an equivalent problem, if I'm rate limited in my communication, if the total rate of communication is at most R, then what is the maximum rate of secret key that I can generate? Okay, so I will then denote those quantities by RSK of eta. RSK is always the communication complexity, the minimum rate of communication required to generate a key of a certain rate. CSK is the CSK of R, or CSK will be the secret key capacity at that rate of communication. So there's a lot of prior work on this. So after the problem was formulated in the original work of Csiszár and Narayan, like Prakash's student Himanshu, who was my colleague now, did tackle this in the two-terminal case. He gave an exact expression for the communication complexity, but that expression involves a lot of auxiliaries and taking limits, essentially an incountably infinite number of auxiliaries. So you can't actually evaluate that exactly. Well, it's quite difficult in general. Then there's a recent slide a few years later, there was a work of Lukoff and Verdú, who gave a different characterization of RSK again in the case of two terminals, and they examined also the key rate versus communication rate trade-off in the case of two terminals in the low communication rate regime, when the communication rates are close to being zero. Prior to this, in fact, there's a single shot version of this. I've been talking about the asymptotic version where you have i.i.d. observations and n goes to infinity. You can only have a single shot version, and you only get one snapshot of the source, and you have to generate a key based upon that. In this case, all the key definitions are going to be perfectly secret definitions. That is, you must have perfect independence of the key from the observation, from the communication, and so on. So in this case, Courtade and Halford gave a characterization of the linear communication complexity. In other words, if the communication is restricted to be only a linear function of your observations, and in that case, what is the maximum amount of secret key that you can generate? But they also showed that you can have nonlinear protocols that beat the linear rate of communication. That is, beat the linear communication. Okay, so final word on the start and the setup. Recall that the use of private randomness did not affect the secret key capacity, but it is still an open question whether it affects the communication rate required to achieve secret key capacity. We believe that it should not. The use of private randomness should not affect the communication rate needed to achieve secret key capacity. There is really no proof. In the two-terminal case, Himanshu has shown that in the two-terminal case, but in general, we don't really have an argument. Okay, so briefly, let me just, so from now on, I'm going to give bounds on the communication complexity. Upper bounds are, unfortunately, are really trivial upper bounds, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. Much time. Upper bounds are all based upon the RCO upper bound. That is, the minimum rate of communication required to achieve secret key capacity is upper bounded by the minimum rate of communication required to achieve omniscience, because you can always get to secret key capacity by omniscience. So that is the upper bound, and I've already explained all of this before. So that is the upper bound. RSK is less than or equal to RCO. The upper bound can be achieved with equality, but it can also be very, very loose. You can easily come up with examples where you almost have to look almost with zero communication or close to zero communication, you can get to secret key capacity, whereas rate of communication required for omniscience is very high. And the sources for which, like the secret key communication complexity equals the rate RCO, the rate of communication for omniscience, for which this equality holds, those we will call RSK maximal sources, and we do have a study of that as well. Okay, so that is the trivial RCO bound, but this bound, okay, so as you saw in this example, we can almost trivially use this bound, there's a trivial strengthening of this bound, or an easy strengthening of this bound. So the bound is basically going to be the same only, that is RSK is less than or equal to RCO, but we will modify the source in such a way that by making the source, like the randomness in the source slightly smaller, you may be able to still retain the same secret key capacity by basically ignoring some of the randomness in the source. You may be able to, the new source that you will get, like by ignoring some of the randomness in the original source, may continue to have the same secret key capacity. Okay? And then when you try to achieve the secret key capacity in that new source, which is in some sense a subsource of the original source, you will use some rate of communication. You can, for example, go through omissions for that source. You can go through omissions for that new source. So and that can also be then ported to the original source, because the secret key capacities of the original source are the same. So any protocol that you're using to generate a maximal rate secret key in sort of the subsource can also be extended, is by very nature also a protocol on the original source. So RSK for the original source is therefore going to be upper bounded by RCO for the subsource. In such cases where you can extract a subsource with the same secret key capacity. May not always be the case. So that is a sort of, here for example, yeah, you can do, there are studies of when you can do, when you can't do that, but again, Chung has some work on this. So here in the spin model, in this case the secret key capacity is 1.5 and the rate RCO for the spin model is 3.5. But then if I throw out half a bit of information from this edge, so I basically throw out half a bit of randomness from this edge. So now I have this new pin model with only 1.5 bits of common randomness here between shared key between 1 and 2. It turns out that the secret key capacity has not changed. I've thrown out some randomness from this source to get here, but the secret key capacity of these two pin models has not changed. So I'll use so an upper bound on RSK, upper bound for RSK on this model is going to be RCO for this model, because I can use a protocol to generate a secret key by going via omniscience in this model to generate a secret key of maximal rate, even that will also work on this. Okay. And so in this case it turns out that see, and here RCO for this model is actually 3. RCO for the original model is 3.5. RCO for this model has gone down. RCO has gone down to 3. So this gives us a stronger upper bound on RSK. You're not familiar?
No, I was thinking of something else, that you can get bounds that are better than the omniscient communication rate, because the optimum secret key can be a function of any one single.
Yeah, but that you don't improve.
Huh?
You don't improve.
No. I'm saying so that the secret key can be obtained as a function of any one of the secrets.
Correct.
And therefore you can ask the question, what is the minimum rate of communication that is needed for all the terminals to generate, let's say, the terminal, the signal, I will construct the signal of terminal 1.
Right, yeah. I know. I understand that, yeah.
The problem is that there is no single letter expression for that.
That's right.
But in these examples, I wonder whether
It might be doable, yeah. Maybe that's, I don't think we've looked at that at all, but like that might be possible.
So for the two-terminal case, is RCO tight or even there?
No. The two-terminal case also RCO is not tight.
It's an exact expression which is strictly smaller than.
Not always, it can be.
no, you can just slip in both, and both the terminals have.
Precisely. I mean, you can just do slip and roll from one terminal to the other. Okay, so then that suffices. Like you don't need to have both terminals go through omniscience. I mean, only one terminal has to transfer its information to the other terminal. That suffices. Right. So this idea can be extended, and we have like bounds. So if you can say the same thing, that for any hypergraphical source this can be done. The really interesting part of all of this is that basically we're throwing out sort of edge randomness, throwing out some randomness on the edges. We find a hypergraphical source which still keeps the same secret key capacity of the original hypergraphical source, but has slightly smaller RCO or something like that. So, and this can be sort of formulated as a linear program, and this bound can be evaluated in polynomial time using linear program for hypergraph. So that is one thing. And so in particular, as a specific case, like if you look at it as a pin model, that is like a source on a graph, defined on a graph with only pairwise secret keys to start with. Then we obtain this bound. That is the secret key capacity, the communication complexity of a pin model is bounded above by this quantity here, number of terminals minus 2 multiplied by the secret key capacity. And this is actually the same as the upper bound that can be derived from the spanning tree packing protocol. So briefly, what is the spanning tree packing protocol? It is like, this is another protocol to generate a maximal rate secret key. So you remember that like here you have, here's a pin model. with a secret key capacity of 2. You have 2 random variables sitting on this edge, 2 random variables on this edge, 1 on this, 1 on this. All of them are, just think of them as uniform bits. So the secret key capacity of this was, as already shown in the previous example, is 2. I will break this up into a pair of spanning trees. So this model, this pin model is basically a disjoint union of these 2 pin models. So these are now trees, and so on each of these trees, I can use communication to generate 1 bit of secret key using each of these trees. So there are 2 trees, I can generate 1 bit of secret key using each of these trees. So in general, if I have a source, if I have a general pin model, I will just sort of use a spanning tree packing to generate 1 bit of key for each of the spanning trees. And how do you generate 1 bit of, so the protocol, communication protocol is that each of the terminals, each of the nodes in the tree will simply communicate, will look at all the bits that it observes, and it communicates pairwise modulo 2 sums of bits along its edges. Okay, so if it has d edges coming out of it, it will take d minus 1 pairwise sums in some order. You just take it in some clockwise order or something like that of the edges coming out, and you take pairwise modulo 2 sums and just send all of that information out into public. So in this particular case, this terminal will transmit the modulo 2 sum of xi1 2 and xi1 3, and this terminal transmits the modulo 2 sum of these 2 and so on. Okay. And it can be shown that you can extract a secret key using this communication. So this is briefly, very, very, very briefly, the spanning tree packing protocol. All right, the more interesting, okay, so I have about 15 minutes to cover the most interesting part of all of this. Lower bounds on secret key, on communication complexity. So to start with, so again, recall that this notion of the multivariate mutual information as being a minimization of an information theoretic functional of this partition-wise mutual information. You minimize that over all partitions. So again, let me start with a fundamental partition, that is the finest partition achieving this minimum. I will define a conditional multivariate mutual information using P star alone. So this is just for, you can define, this is my definition. I'm taking this as a definition that this conditional mutual information, this conditional partition-wise, conditional MMI is defined as, is always defined with respect to the fundamental partition for the unconditional version. Okay, this is an artificial definition, but I'm just going to use it for convenience, because all my results are going to be expressed in terms of this. So there is a P star for the unconditional version of multivariate mutual information. Okay, and then I'm just going to use the same P star to define my conditional version of multivariate mutual information, where I'm just going to conditioning on L throughout, or wherever I have to take, wherever I have entropries, I'll just consider the conditional entropy. Okay, but the partition here is always going to be the fundamental partition, which I've identified for the entire source function at the beginning.
But you could in principle,
you can in principle define it as exactly the same way. That is, you can do it for P and then take minimum over P. It will then depend, the minimum partition also depend on N. So I'm just sort of, I'm not doing that. Minimizing partitions will also depend on the random variable being conditioned. That I'm not doing. Okay, so then we define this notion of, we will define minor common information in this fashion using this measure of common information, using the measure of multivariate mutual information. A Wiener sequence is a sequence of random variables such that the normalized conditional MMI of the sequence of random variables goes to 0 as n goes to infinity, when they're very normalized by n, the number of the rate of any such, so if such a sequence is called a Wiener sequence, the rate of a Wiener sequence I will define as the lim sup of 1 over n of the entropy of ln as n goes to infinity. This is the rate of that Wiener sequence, and the minimum rate of such a Wiener sequence we will call the Wiener common information. Okay, is that clear? Okay, the minimum rate of a Wiener sequence we will call the Wiener common information in this context. It is actually some sort of an asymptotic measure of a Wiener common information, for those who know what I'm talking about. Asymptotic version of the Wiener common information. So the theorem that we had in the sort of this earlier work of myself with my student, without, so here in this case, this theorem we could only prove without private randomness. As I said, it should not matter whether you use private randomness or not. It should not matter. Our techniques in this case are only able to do it without private randomness. That is, the secret key capacity, the communication complexity is lower bounded by the Wiener common information minus the secret key capacity. Upper bound is always h of xm minus I of xm. Lower bound is the Wiener common information minus I of xm. The proof idea, maybe I look at. All right. So this proof was first given for the two-terminal case by Himanshu, and we appropriately extended it in the multi-terminal case. In the two-terminal case, this is actually an equality. So someone asked about the two-terminal case. The two-terminal case, Himanshu actually showed this is an equality. Okay, but it's not. This is in the multi-terminal case. No, that's not. It's not true in general. It's not an equality. Yeah. So the idea simply is that when you want to generate a secret key. The pair, the key, as well as the communication that you use to generate the key put together, form a Wiener sequence. Why is that? See, if the mutual information after conditioning, given all of this, after conditioning on k and f, if there is still some mutual information left among the random variables x1 up to xn, you can build on that to extract more bits of key. So you cannot have a maximal rate secret key if upon conditioning on the key that you've already achieved and the communication you have used to achieve that key, there is still some randomness left in the system that you can exploit. There's some common randomness still left in the system that you can exploit to generate a key. Okay, that is roughly the idea. That is why this forms a Wiener sequence. That is the key, maximal rate key, as well as the communication needed to achieve it, always forms a Wiener sequence. You can prove it, of course, formally. And from that, it's a two-line argument that shows that the minimum rate of any rate of communication that you needed to get to maximum rate secret key must be lower bounded. So this Wiener common information can be extracted. Can be actually explicitly computed, exactly computed in certain cases. So, for example, in a hypergraphical source, the Wiener common information is precisely the sum of all the random variables sitting on the hyperedges, the weights of the hyperedges. For those hyperedges, such that cross at least two parts of the fundamental partition that are not contained completely within some block of the fundamental partition. Okay, this is a characterization of the Wiener common information for a hypergraphical source model. So the proof here is, maybe the only thing that I want to mention here is that the proof is very nice, but I can't cover it in the few minutes that I have left. It is a very nice proof, and actually. The last time I was here in 2016, when we had the bits workshop, I learned about this Beresford-Bolobash elementary compression argument that I went back and applied to this problem, and turned out that it gave me a converse result on this particular thing. The Beresford-Bolobash elementary compression argument. I think Venkatanandram gave this talk in the applied probability workshop that was conducted after the bits workshop, I think. And so using that, I was able to derive this result. So. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So in this example, so here is the fundamental. So I just want to give an example. Two pin models, one of which this is the fundamental partition. I've drawn it in dashed lines. So these two are one block of the fundamental partition, and these two are individual cells, individual blocks, singletons. So here, for this pin model, all four are the fundamental partition consists of the singleton partition. The Wiener common information in this case is the sum of the weights on the edges that cross two parts of the partition. So this edge, and this edge cross two parts of the partition, whereas this edge is contained completely within the block of some cell of the fundamental partition. So the Wiener common information in this case is 3. In this case, it is all the edges cross the fundamental partition, or cross the cells of the fundamental partition. And so the Wiener common information here is 4.5. So if you plug in the lower bound, we get an RSK for this pin model, we get an RSK or lower bound of 3, which is the same as the RCO upper bound. So this pin model, actually the communication complexity is exactly equal to 3. Whereas here, as you can see, the lower bound, the upper bound, here the upper bound, the RCO upper bound was 3 or 3.5 or something, whereas the lower bound is only 1.5. So there is a gap. And we're not, in this case, we're not, I think we have been able to show using other techniques that the actual communication complexity here is also 3. It's not 1.5. Okay, so let me just give some more, for the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Okay, maybe one thing here is that I asked the question, when is the source RSK maximum? So when is RSK always equal to RCO for a source? So for a hypergraphical source, we can answer that exactly. It is precisely when every edge of the hypergraphical source crosses at least two cells of the fundamental partition. Crosses some two cells of the fundamental partition, but is not contained in a particular cell of the fundamental partition. can, for a general source, like you can always, so we don't have exact expressions for the Wiener common information, but we can obtain, we have lower bounds, we have non-trivial lower bounds. These are not easy to prove. They're nice, they have finally a nice form, but they're kind of non-trivial to prove. And so these are useful in the sense that like this lower bound is proved in an information theoretic fashion. It uses sort of ideas from Wiener's original paper. This lower bound, and so this actually this lower bound of the Wiener common information, if I apply to a hypergraphical source, will give an alternative proof of the Wiener common information expression that I gave for the hypergraphical source using the Beresford-Balobash compression argument. And in particular, this gives us, by applying this lower bound on the Wiener common information to the RSK problem, we get a lower bound on RSK, because RSK is bounded by Wiener common information minus equal to capacity. So we get a lower bound on RSK. I should add that like the proof techniques we have so far really are just very, very exceptionally clever uses of, I'm saying exceptionally because it's not that I have used any of them. I'm not doing these proofs. It's mostly done by my student or Chung. I have some contributions, but not the exceptionally clever versions. The exceptionally clever versions of they're all these applications of the subordinate property of entropy, nothing else. This so-called Shannon type inequality. But just used in a very, very clever fashion. How much time do I have left? 6, 7. Good. Here's another theorem. This only applies. This is the lower bound that applies to hypergraphical sources, and this is stronger than like the previous theorems. That it is not just lower bound on the communication complexity of achieving secret key capacity. It's the communication complexity of achieving a secret key of some rate eta. Any rate eta you give me, what is the secret key? What is the communication complexity I need to achieve that secret key of rate eta? That's a lower bound on this. Okay. The lower bound is proportional to theta and some constant which depends. You take some partition of your set of terminals. There's a coefficient that you can compute from that partition, and so that coefficient multiplied by the desired secret key rate gives you a lower bound on the communication complexity needed to get to that secret key rate. So in particular, if you take this partition to be the set of singletons, we get this lower bound. That is, the secret communication complexity to RSK of eta is greater than or equal to this coefficient multiplied by eta. Where this coefficient is simply the total number of terminals minus the largest size of hyperedge, the largest cardinality of hyperedge divided by the largest cardinality of hyperedge minus 1. So in particular, if you apply this to a pin model, S, the largest cardinality of hyperedge is always 2. Every edge is of cardinality 2. Only when this is a true vertices in a pin model. Because hypergraph is just a graph. S is always 2. So this gives us a lower bound. For a pin model, the lower bound is simply RSK eta is greater than or equal to RSK eta is greater than or equal to B minus the total, the number of vertices minus 2 multiplied by eta. But then the reverse direction inequality is just obtained directly from the spanning tree packing protocol that I have given earlier by Csiszár and Navin Kashyap.
So we get some kind of equation for the simple this last one.
Intuition for this lower bound? Yeah. No. Lower bound, intuition for lower bound, no. Upper bound is just comes from the spanning tree packing protocol. That's why you have an equality here. The lower bound, it is just like you have to. The lower bound here is a consequence of this inequality, and this inequality to prove this, it makes essential use, and it's not the essential use of this so-called Edmonds-Greig algorithm in combinatorial optimization. It is really nothing but submodularity taken to the extreme. Like you take submodularity and you just apply submodularity in a very nice fashion. It makes essential use of this algorithm and other things. It's not just this algorithm that gives you this. There are other things that ingredients that go into the proof. But it's basically a very, very clever way of applying submodularity to get to this. I cannot do justice to this. There's no way I can do justice to this in the amount of time that I have. And in particular, this shows that for a pin model, non-interactive communication suffices to achieve secret key at any rate. The spanning tree packing protocol is a non-interactive communication protocol. That is, it's just a one-shot communication. Just happens in one shot. It's not like after some party communicates, another party should communicate, and so on. That kind of thing is not. So non-interactive communication. Last thing before I stop, we can do more. We can define the rate region. We can for this multi-terminal problem, we can define a rate region to consist of all the achievable discussion and key rate tuples. Okay, so from each terminal, how much communication do I need? Ri is, if I call that a communication from terminal I, the communication rate from terminal I look at all the possible protocols that allow me to generate a secret key of rate theta, and what is the rate of communication required from every terminal in each of these protocols, collect them all into a rate region. So you can ask, can you characterize this rate region? It's a complicated region. It's not at all, even like simple, some rate is the minimum rate of communication required itself is hard. But we're asking for a big thing now. We're asking for the entire rate region, which will answer all our questions regarding communication complexity. And we're able to do something here. So we can able to give sort of inequalities governing governing points in this rate region. Okay, so supporting hyperplanes for this rate region. Again, using nothing but submodularity, but it's non-trivial, completely non-trivial ways of applying submodularity. In this particular instance, the way that this bound was arrived at was by playing with examples and this XITIP. There's this program for proving information theoretic inequalities, written starting with the work of Raymond Young. So you just work look into that program. How is the damn thing producing these inequalities and proving these inequalities? Work with examples and then build upon. You have to gain a great amount of intuition going into that. This argument, without XITIP, it would not be possible to get this argument. Only with the help of that, with the intuition that you develop using that piece of software, were you able to get to this argument. Again, I cannot do justice to the proof. Proof is very nice, but completely non-trivial. Elementary, but completely non-trivial. Elementary methods, yeah, nothing, no complications. Elementary in the sense that as long as you know chain rule of mutual information, chain rule of entropy and submodularity of entropy, you're done. Yeah. So in particular, actually using that result. Okay. So one consequence of that result I just want to mention. So as a consequence, we have inequalities of this nature. So for example, this says that if I have a set of if I have some subset P of the terminals, among that, so within that subset P, there is some source. That subset observes some part of the source. So that subset by itself may be able to generate a maximal rate secret key which will have this rate. That subset itself will generate a secret key of this rate. Now, if I want overall to generate a key of rate at least of rate theta, which is larger than the amount that is generatable by just that small subset, well, I must have all the other terminals communicate at some rate. All the terminals that are not in that subset must communicate at a rate which is sort of proportional to the excess rate of key that I need, to the excess rate of secret key. That the maximum rate of secret key that set of terminals can generate is this guy here. I'm asking for more, so the other terminals must communicate at a rate that is proportional to, at least at a rate proportional to the excess amount of secret key that I need. That I'm looking for. Okay, finally, that result also allows us to completely characterize for a pin model defined on a tree. If the underlying graph is a tree, it completely characterizes the rate region, the achievable rate discussion rate region. It is precisely what we can get using spanning tree packing. The spanning tree packing is the optimal protocol there. All the rate points in that region are precisely those that are achievable using spanning tree packing, and there are no other such rate. There are no other rate points. Okay, but this is the only model that we have been able to solve completely. A pin model of action. So I will leave it at that, and so there are these open questions. That I would like to have addressed. Thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions.
Yes. Everyone that is known, yeah. Two-terminal case, yes. Two-terminal case, we know these answers. I think this result of Luke often will do has, for the two-terminal case, if you only restrict yourself to binary sources, then I think interaction, there is some characterization precisely. There is a characterization of when exactly interaction helps. I think the two source, that source should be what is called a binary symmetric source. That is, the two components of the source should be one that is obtained by fitting a binary symmetric channel in between. That's precisely when interaction does not help. I think interaction helps in all other cases. Himanshu, is Himanshu here? Or? That's correct? But this is a precise characterization, but like in three terminals, there are examples.
The fourth item there, when you say helpers, so if you have helpers, then the analog of spanning tree packing is standard tree packing, which is known not to be adequate. What happens in that case? Do you have examples which show?
It becomes very complicated. It's very messy, highly complicated. For examples we have, we had submitted a paper, I think Shun was handling that paper, and like he saw how complicated it was, and he said that we should simplify it, and so, but yeah, it gets very messy. It's a big mess, with helpers. There's no good intuition.